but thank you everybody for being here today. It's such a pleasure to be with my co-panelists speaking about this really important subject today. A brief overview here of the presentation agenda. We'll be talking about the work that Charlene and Whitney have been doing, and then I'll be talking more broadly about the work that we've been doing at the archives in terms of accessing residential school records. I had the pleasure of meeting Charlene and Whitney recently when they came down to the archives to do some research with the records that we have, which was what led to this discussion today. I'm going to pass it over now to Charlene to give us some background about both herself and the St. Joseph's mission.
Good, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for taking time out on a Saturday to be able to listen and learn with us. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do a presentation along with Whitney on the work that we've been doing at St. Joseph's Mission, investigating the disappearance and murder of our children at the residential school. So St. Joseph's Mission Residential School is located just kilometers from the Williams Lake First Nation Community Core, also known as Sugarcane. The St. Joseph's Mission was operated as an Indian residential school between 1886 and 1981, where thousands of children were forced to attend the school, which was administered by the Catholic Oblates and various orders of the nuns as well, as part of the residential school system set up by the Government of Canada. The Onward Ranch was added to the Oblate holdings in 1964 and operated as a ranch and farm to sustain the St. Joseph's Mission. And a quote by our Cookpit Willie Sellers, who's a very strong leader and advocate and support for Whitney and I. His quote was, "It's time for our community and those around the country and beyond to know the truth of St. Joseph's Mission." Good. This is a picture of St. Joseph's Mission back in 1965. The school closed in 1981, but basically when you look at this picture, there were 400 plus students in this institution. When you look at this building, you can, through the middle there, know that on the left side, that was all the boys' side. There was junior, senior, and intermediate boys that were housed in dormitories in these institutions. On the top floors is where the nuns and the priests and the teachers and people lived in that institution. There was a kitchen area in the bottom area of the whole facility. On the right side is where the girls were residing along with the nuns, and again, junior, intermediate, and senior girls during the time at the residential school. There's a lot that you don't see in this facility, but this building no longer exists. It has been torn down. So this was the school in 1965. I was there in 1967 specifically, and that was during Bishop O'Connor's time of abusing several young girls at the school. Thank you. Next. Good. See, so the St. Joseph's Mission Caribou Industrial School timelines that are important to know is that from 1891 to 1920, the school operated as an industrial school and St. Joseph's Industrial School, where the main activities that were happening at the school was farming, where they were wanting to teach them how to sew and how to bake and how to raise chickens, and anyhow, it was a farming school, and that was the main activity. There was no education, formal education. From 1920 to 1927, the Caribou Industrial School, it was just a name change basically to Caribou Industrial School, and from 1923 to 1981. The Caribou Residential School, it was then known as the Caribou Residential School, where it changed into a residential school, and formal education classes were part of that. In 1929 to 1981, it was known as the St. Joseph's Mission School. From 1932 to 1935, It was the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. Again, a name change from 1963 to 1969. It was back to St. Joseph's Residential School. Up to its closure from 1967 to 1981, the Caribou Student Residence and the was known as the Caribou Student Residence, where this was the period of integration where they were planning to eventually close the residential schools, and so a part of that plan was to integrate us into public schools here in Williams Lake, and I was a part of that integration process in 1968, 1969, and I went through an experience of not only the trauma of residential school, but being integrated into a non-Indigenous school in School District 27. The racism and the abuse that we suffered was horrendous. It was another layer of trauma that many of us had to endure, not only here at St. Joseph's, but throughout the province as well. June 30th in 1981 was when St. Joseph's Mission Residential School closed. And when you think of 1981, that's not very far off. So several generations from 1891 to 1981 attended these institutions, and various children from various communities around the interior that included the Chilcotin, the Tekel-Dene, the Southern Secwepemc, the Statliam up around the Mount Currie, Lillooet, Lytton area. All of those communities sent children to St. Joseph's Mission Indian Residential School. Thank you. Next.
Sorry, just having trouble moving it forward suddenly. There we go.
Okay, great. Some of my own personal experience at residential school, I attended for 4 years. Again, I mentioned 1967 as one of those years being at the residential school. And I also mentioned Bishop O'Connor because he was the principal, he was the administrator during that time. And little did I know that he was abusing girls. And there are children that were actually born from the residential school where different priests were the fathers of these children. So a lot of trauma in the RCMP investigation, prosecution of the three that were charged in Williams Lake. So Father McIndy, Brother Dowdy, and Bishop O'Connor were the three that were convicted criminally for abuse at the residential school. I'm sure that there were more, but way back when they took them to court in the late 80s and early 90s, not very many people were willing to step forward, but we were fortunate that we had residential school warriors in women and men that held these priests and nuns accountable for their work. In terms of my own personal experience, my parents attended, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, right from opening to closing of the institution. So that several generations of our children throughout the province in all 18 residential schools that operated, that attended these institutions. Next. Thank you. One of my personal stories is that, and personal impacts that drive me and have driven me for 30 years at least, is that my grandpa committed suicide there and is buried somewhere. Back in the 1920s, when he committed suicide, suicide is not Catholic, so they don't bury you in the graveyard there. So he's buried somewhere out on the grounds of St. Joseph's Mission. And for myself, I did not realize until we had Elizabeth Furness that worked with us at the Caribou Tribal Council. When priests were charged and we were beginning to deal with residential schools in Williams Lake, we wanted to try and understand what is the history of St. Joseph's and what happened there, and what are we going to do about this, and how are we going to heal from all of this? So Elizabeth Furness was charged with the responsibility of looking back on the history of St. Joseph's. And as a staff member, she did her research, had access to a lot of documents at the federal government and with the Catholic oblates and other places to put her research together. So she wrote a book and detailed a lot of St. Joseph's history in Victims of Benevolence. In that book, she does outline, not only my grandpa, Augustine Allen's suicide, but also Duncan Sticks that ran away and froze to death as a little 8-year-old. These children were very young when they died. And when I think of my grandpa, the sad part of his death and his suicide and his being buried there somewhere is our family was never notified. They never told us that he died, that he committed suicide. They just buried him there. And then they tell you later. So I know that my family wrote to Ottawa trying to ask for our other family to be taken away from St. Joseph's because we didn't want them to commit suicide either. So I wasn't aware of that because my mom went to residential school. But again, my mom was very Catholic, where she didn't want us to be saying a whole lot about what happened at the mission. At the same time, again, through the book, I learned of Grandpa committing suicide and being buried there somewhere. And so when I asked her about it, I remember her just saying, well, yeah, that happened, but she didn't really want to talk about it. Neither did I push it. So I just know. And I know that as a former student for 30 years advocating, our families always knew that our children died there and never came home, but no one believed us, so it took 215 children that were discovered and, are going to be recovered and honored properly at the Kamloops before people would listen and believe and know that really had happened. So, part of my commitment in working with Whitney and Williams Lake First Nation is, along with my grandpa, there are several other children. In January, we released our findings were 93 reflections, so separate from my grandpa, there are so many other children that never came home. And this work is about them and honoring those families and communities that they come from, and how do we bring closure to our nations. Thank you. Next. Great, this is, they must have found this somewhere because normally I don't put something in that is something that I did, but I remember Doug Todd followed the residential school story way back from the times that Brother Dowdy, Father McIntyre, and Bishop O'Connor were charged for sex crimes at St. Joseph's. So he was there when we went in and out of court with Bishop O'Connor and eventually ended that in a healing circle. But he came back recently in 2021 to just say, okay, they found remains. What do you think now? So my statement back then is we didn't, and this is something I say, to our own people, because I don't want us to lose a sense of hope, that this deep, dark history of 150 years of institutionalization will ever destroy us. So I do let our people know that we didn't lose our language. We didn't lose our culture. So don't talk like we did. We're stronger for all of this, is a comment that I made during that time with Doug Todd. Again, I as chief of Esquet, I've served 3 terms as chief in the community. But regardless of whatever role and responsibility I took on as a chief or worked provincially or nationally, residential schools was always on my plate in one way or another, or it was on the side of my desk. And I've continued to advocate for various students. So the work that I do with Williams Lake First Nation is just so powerful and so meaningful for me at this point. And we will be here until we are able to find our children and be able to honor them with the respect and dignity that they should have had in the first place. They weren't. But again, there's nothing stopping us from going back and making sure that what we need to do as former students of St. Joseph's and all the other schools across the province, that we don't take that trauma and don't grow from that. You know, like I do say, we are going to be stronger for all of this. And the creators made sure, you know, that we have strong language, culture, and traditions to help us through these difficult times. So thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that advocacy in a little bit, but we're going to switch now to talk a little bit about archival records and the impact of that. So thanks again. So as Jenny mentioned in her introduction, I work for the BC Archives. The BC Archives is the provincial repository for the government of BC, which means that we take records created in government ministries and broader public sector organizations that have been appraised as having long-term value. But we also take non-government records. We acquire non-government records and we preserve and make them accessible. And in recent years, we have had a number of collections of records that relate to residential schools that have come into our holdings. And that's what I'm here to focus on today. I've been thinking a lot about the theme of the conference, which is memory. And one of the other things when I was approached to speak at the conference, one of the other things that I thought about speaking to on that theme was about how archivists over time have decided what records are kept, what memories are kept. And I think this is something that's so important to think about in this case, is that we often in our society place a huge amount of emphasis on the saved, hard, tangible records. But as Charlene mentions, the people that went to St. Joseph's Mission School or its various iterations, the families of those folks, they have always known the truth about what happened. And it's what really is happening now is a combining of the understood history of the communities with the evidentiary value that we find in the archival record. This is a brief overview of some of the archival records that relate to residential schools that are found in our holdings. One of the biggest collections is the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. So in 2019, the BC Archives acquired the records of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, or OMI Lacombe as it's most recently called. The Oblates are still a missionary priest organization. They are a religious order of missionary priests, and they operated missions around the province. And as part of that, they operated 10 residential schools. So the residential schools, as Charlene has touched on, have a complex history around their operations. But for the most part, this is very broadly speaking, for the most part, they were the sort of top of the organizational structure. It was the Department of Indian Affairs. And then usually in most cases, an order of priests would be the administrators, and they would also employ a female order, religious order, as well to work alongside the priests. I've listed the schools and the locations of the schools that the Oblates operated there. The Oblates for many decades had an archives that they had in Vancouver. For those who maybe haven't done archival research or maybe haven't in some time, we tend to use the word public, meaning government archives, and private, meaning any non-government archives. So they operated as a private archives. They would have people come in on an appointment basis to review the records. But when the Oblates started to amalgamate their orders across the country into one as their numbers shrunk, they began distributing their records to mostly public organizations across the country. The records that we received are mostly from BC and a little bit from the Yukon as well. We also, as you may have heard in the news just in the last few days, we are in the process of formally acquiring the records of the Sisters of St. Anne. The Sisters of St. Anne were a female order, religious order, and they worked at a number of schools as well in British Columbia. At the moment, we are providing access to the Sisters of St. Anne records, although they are not legally in our custody yet, but they will be soon. So we provide access in the same way that we provide access to the other records in our holdings. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. The staff of the archives used to say, we don't have any residential school records. We don't have, when people would come in and ask about that. And what they meant was that we don't have the school registers. We don't have some of those formal documentation that would have been kept by the federal government and ultimately has gone to Library and Archives Canada. But we've always had records related to residential schools. We've had sound recordings. We have a huge collection of oral history recordings, and in many cases, those recordings include people talking about their experiences attending the schools. We have a large collection of material kept in our library collection as well. And of course, really importantly, we have other government records that do connect to the experiences of families in terms of the residential school experience, particularly vital events records, coroner's reports and inquests and inquiries. Lands records, of course, are hugely important. They often show how things, how lands moved and changed over time, including the spaces where the schools were located. And then again, other non-government records, we have a huge amount of what we are called ethnographic records, which often record experiences from schools as well. In terms of accessing records, our typical way of providing access to records is to have folks come in to the archives on site. Register as a researcher, come to Victoria, send somebody else to Victoria if you're not able to make it, email in asking for information. But the last year, as Charlene mentioned, has really changed the way everybody has been thinking about this information and how important it is. So we've been working to change our practices as well. And it's very slow. And I recognize how slow we are to catch up to what is needed in terms of providing access. Charlene and Whitney did come down. This is an image of another man from the Ktunaxa Nation. He's now, this is at the time, he was the Director of Traditional Knowledge and Language for the Ktunaxa Nation. He's now a chief in the Ktunaxa Nation. But he also came down to do research on residential school records just before the pandemic. We are working as much as we can to work directly with the communities that are doing this research and gathering information for use by the community and for sharing with families. So rather than passively waiting for folks to come to us, we are trying, if we can, to reach out, or when folks do come to us, making sure that we're flexible with the way in which we provide access to records. And importantly, one of the things that we have prioritized is digitizing all of the records related to residential schools with the intention of ultimately handing over full copies of those records into the communities. As with everything in government, it's complicated. So we're working with lawyers on a way that we can formally make these transfers. And I'm really hoping that this gets pushed through soon, because folks like Charlene and Whitney have been waiting for a very long time to get full access to the records. In the meantime, we are doing everything we can to accommodate groups to come in and do the work in the reference room whenever possible. I'm going to pass it over now to Whitney to talk about the work that she's been doing and that their group has been doing with the Williams Lake First Nation.
Great, thanks, Genevieve. Good morning, everybody. I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you for having us to talk about this extremely important topic and get a sense of where we are in our investigation too. So this is a photo of the St. Joseph's Mission Caribou Industrial School in the late 1800s. So I've got a variety of topics I'm going to cover, but one of the outstanding things about this particular photo is the buildings that are actually in it. So this is a very early photo. And as you can see, there's definitely a lot of buildings that are present on the site, even in the early days. And one of the complexities of this investigation in terms of looking for unmarked graves and disappeared children is the complexities of the actual site. So just note that the buildings in this particular photo. Great. And this is a modern photo. It's a bit of an artsy photo. I took this from the grass, but it does show kind of the extent of the modern property. These are barn structures that are still standing at the SJM site, an example of the landscape conditions. So these are two of the oldest buildings. They are still standing. They are in the photograph that you just looked at, but of course the property conditions have changed. So when we first arrived on site to start this investigation, there was just a variety of debris. Obviously the grass is at 4 feet high in this photo. So there was a big undertaking to sort of even just preliminarily clean up the site before we could start any investigation. So that's just a comparison shot to see what it looks like in modern day. So very early on, and Charlene did mention to Kamloops. So early on in the investigation to Kamloops, Chief Willie Sellers came to me, and I do work for the nation as well too. I am an archaeologist, and we had a bit of a caucus, and he said, you know, they've made an announcement into Kamloops, and we're going to need to start immediately into the investigation at the St. Joseph's Mission. So we got rolling almost immediately in those early days, just sort of started headlong into it, and very early on outlined what our response objectives would be. So these are the WLFN response objectives: engaging local legal and technical experts to develop and implement and document a culturally appropriate community-based response and search for missing children, SJM. So that step involved bringing on both Charlene and also Nancy Sandy, who is a non-practicing lawyer and community member of WLFN, who joined our team as well too. So she's engaged on the research front. Asserting jurisdiction for all work related to the St. Joseph's Mission IRS investigation. As Genevieve mentioned, the wheels of government are often slow. And so this is one that, although we have made that assertion, we do continue to have to keep making it on a variety of different fronts. Facilitating a culturally appropriate community-based inquiry into SJM that gives voice and encourages those most affected by missing children to tell their story in a context that ensures safety, promotes respect, and enables healing. A special investigative unit to investigate our missing children, a special prosecutor for crimes against our children, and a trauma-informed coroner. So these are specific asks that we have of the Attorney General, Public Solicitor, Safety General's Office, as well as the RCMP. So working with those institutions in order to facilitate the community-based inquiry. And utilizing the profile of Williams Lake First Nation initiatives to educate all Canadians to the reality, purpose, and impact of the schools or institutions. So this is a big one, and we'll touch on it further on when we talk about databasing and taking in archival information, but this is really key. You can imagine in the wake of the Kamloops announcement and also in the wake of the announcement at WLFN, there's been a lot of of ignorance, just in terms of not understanding what residential schools were and how they impacted people, but also of just complete denial. And even in the wake of these discoveries and announcements, there's still folks who believe that it is, for lack of a better word, a hoax. So really pushing the public education pieces is going to be key for us. Next slide. So our preliminary investigation involves 3 components: geophysical investigation, archival and photographic research, and survivor interviews. So some of the information and resources that are required to do this work include traditional use interviews conducted historically with members of the Williams Lake First Nation, which Genevieve also did touch on. These are the more ethnographic accounts and survivor interviews that we had already gathered previous to the investigation starting. So they were in community and available for us to start using immediately. Retrieval and review of archival and photographic materials. So from institutions like RBCM, the National Truth and Reconciliation Center, as well as other smaller institutions, religious bodies, community members as well. So comprehensive ground and aerial analysis, and financial support from both the federal and provincial governments. I mean, that is another key. Like, we don't often like to talk about the money, but these types of things are expensive, and they're time consuming and capacity draining. So there has to be some recognition of that requirement. Next slide. So the geophysical investigation that's being conducted is using multiple ground penetrating radar units, as well as magnetometry, LiDAR. For those who don't know, that's, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's a light aerial imaging. So it uses light and essentially beams down to the surface of the earth and makes a 3D model. So lots of different types of technology being used. So we are currently in phase 2 of the geophysical investigation. And we have been mapping out the existing graves and the modern extent of the cemetery. There is a cemetery at the site. It was used historically as well as throughout the residential school era. So that is one thing that takes some extremely detailed analysis, and what we're working on actually right now in phase 2. So detailed recordings of headstones, as well as lots of measurements, lots of GPSing, and really this comprehensive analysis is geared towards potential exhumation, potential excavation of that site in order to retrieve deceased children from that cemetery and get them to their home communities. So that work has been supported through records obtained from various archival sources, including RBCM. So just know that, a point there is that we are taking the material that we, gathered in all of these places in terms of archives, and actually applying them and using them in the geophysical investigation. So this is sort of our opening ceremony at the mission. This is a GPR multi-channel unit, so ground penetrating radar unit. This is the actual equipment that's being used at the mission. And you can't see it very well in this photo, but there are tobacco ties on this machine. And so just taking the cultural element very seriously as well too. And I touch on that further down, but making sure that our teams are trauma informed and also doing work in a culturally sensitive way.
Sorry, hang on.
That's okay.
It gets stuck sometimes. There we go.
No worries. Okay, so archival and photographic research. So Williams Lake First Nation has been working to identify important archival records, including those housed at the following institutions. So there is a laundry list there. Those are the first institutions that we've touched base with in terms of records. So Museum of Caribou Chilcotin is actually in Williams Lake. They do have a selection of residential school records that we've been able to access. Library and Archives Canada, as Genevieve mentioned, lots of material there. BC Provincial Archives, so that is the RBCM. Archdiocese of Vancouver, Prince George as well. Northern Shuswap Tribal Council, Charlene was discussing that earlier. That's the Caribou Tribal Council. They're in Williams Lake, local to Williams Lake. Skedam First Nation Archives. So Escat is a community very close to Williams Lake who actually did have their own set of archives as well too, related to residential school. And then also personal and historic archives from members and community at large. So this is a key as well too, is not all of the information is in institutions. There are photographs and bits of archival information coming in from all over the place. People who have just kept them in their personal archives for years, or maybe passed down through a family member who's passed away, and then they're left with these archives. One fairly spectacular collection of actually archaeology tools, so stone tools that were collected at the mission by one of the brothers there, was actually repatriated to Williams Lake First Nation through a family member who had essentially been gifted these things in the will of that particular brother, and they contacted the nation and said, I would like to give these back. And so that's a true example of how things are coming in sort of unexpectedly. We didn't know that those existed. And then this person came forward and proffered to give them back. So this is an example of photographs from the Archdiocese in Vancouver. So this is one that wasn't available through the NCTR and wasn't in any other archives, but we reached out directly to the Archdiocese and they were able to provide us with some photos. So just to say that, you know, again, even when we think we have a handle on where things are and how much volume there is, there's always a few things coming out of the woodwork. And this is a good example of that. It's from 1946. It's quite old. Okay, so I had plans to put in a nice photograph at this point of documents that I took photographs of when Charlene and I were able to attend the RBCM. They're really poor quality photos, so I just left it out. But what I would like to explain with this slide is that in terms of the geophysical investigation, one thing that has been key for us is survey plans. And so when we attended the RBCM, we did find in the records legal survey plans, very large tabletop sized plans of the school and drawings of the school, buildings that were there at the time, and also proposed replacements of the buildings. So actually where a footprint of an existing structure is shown, and then a detailed map of what is intended to be built over top of it is also shown on that plan. And I can't even say how much that this has been helpful in terms of the geophysical investigation. So when we get back from the geophysical team data, they'll show us the data and they say, well, we have, obviously thousands of reflections. And some of the reflections are infrastructure. So the 93 reflections that are indicative of burials are outside of that number. But looking at the survey plans and saying, well, we've got this particular pipe running in this direction. Could it potentially be that? We've got this foundation of a building that used to be there. Potentially it could be that. And so these are critical pieces of information, and ones that we actually didn't have going into the geophys. We started that process without having these plans, and then found them kind of after we had done the release of the results. And so now we're doing a comparative analysis. So we're sort of working backward, but this is one of the challenges. We talk about challenges further down, but where we don't know that there's information, sorry about that, where we don't know that information exists and then it comes to us midstream. It's fantastic always to get it, but it does cause us to sort of work in a backwards manner, go back and check over everything. So that's one example. And then I think I've got a second example on the next slide there. Father Thomas memoirs. So this is another fantastic example. So while we were at the RBCM, we had a researcher, we have a documentary team working with us as well. And Julian Noisecat Brave is a researcher that is working on this documentary with their team. So he was listening to one of these audio snippets that is in RBCM, and Charlene was across the room going through Father Thomas's memoirs, and the two of them meet up, like they intersect. So this audio recording was of First Nations people from Alkali Lake, which is Eskedum, talking with an interviewer about Father Thomas and his memoirs. And in that audio, there's reference to a graveyard. And then, so I said, so Julian came over to me and said, wow, like this is, you know, in the audio, have you heard this? And sort of simultaneously, Charlene is reading through his memoirs. And sure enough, we flip open the memoirs and it's referenced, the graveyard is referenced there, but not only referenced to the graveyard, but to a student who actually died while crossing the river to the mission and was then buried in that cemetery. So again, huge pieces of critical information. We don't have a name for that student yet, but we have added her to sort of the death register from that institution. So really, really important pieces of information, and just sort of a sliver here on the audio and a sliver in the textual records, and the two came together in a really fantastic way. So another prime example of why these records are so important. Is that back to you?
Thanks, Whitney. It's back to me for one slide. And a lot of what I've got listed in this has been touched on by Whitney's slides as well, but we wanted to talk a little bit more about where are all these records and what that, you know, how complicated it is to pull all of the information together in a way that is useful and cohesive for the folks needing to access it. But before I get into that, I want to delve a little bit more into what exactly are the records. So we've heard about a number of types of records. We've heard about plans and audio recordings. We get a lot of requests from Indigenous folks who had been attending one of these places, who know that we have the Oblates records and the Sisters of St. Anne records, and they're looking for student records. And that is something that we don't have in those collections of records. So in those two collections in particular, the records tend to be mostly textual and photographic. The textual records include financial reports, a lot of information about the farming and other activities that happened at the sites. There's a lot of reports about the religious education or the religious teaching of the community members. And there's textual records where there's correspondence between people working at the schools and the Department of Indian Affairs in particular, but also with other religious organizations. That's not to say it's not important. In fact, it's incredibly important information. And there is some really, really useful information that comes out of those records. But it is hard to have to respond to individuals who are looking for something really specific about themselves and let them know that we don't have those records. Our assumption is that most of those records went to the Department of Indian Affairs and therefore should have gone to Library and Archives Canada. And we have been working with folks at Library and Archives Canada and at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to try and bring all of that important information together in one place. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was the result of one of the outcomes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the intention of it is to bring records together from multiple repositories to be in one place. I think Whitney sort of hinted at the difficulties or the time that it takes to get records from the NCTR. And I know I've been working closely with their archivist there, and it's a huge undertaking that they've taken on. I do trust and believe that it will get quicker. It's one of the results of this becoming in the past year something that has had so many eyes on it, this work, which means that there's been a significant increase in requests. But I'm confident that the NCTR and all the other archival repositories, and ours included, are catching up to the need. But it is taking a long time. The Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC is operated by the university, and it focuses on residential schools and hospitals located in BC. And it's very survivor focused. It's very focused on the people and the families. So they've undertaken a number of projects that are not always as specific to the archival research, but we have agreements with both the we being the BC Archives, our BCM, we have agreements with both the NCTR and the Center at UBC to share information with them as we have it scanned and prepared. As I've been listening to Charlene and Whitney, I mentioned this briefly when I talked about the theme of memory, but it strikes me again and again how the incredible power that comes from being the place that controls the records and the written and other types of records. And that's something I try to acknowledge all the time, is that we as the archives are in a position of power that is not balanced, it's not fair. And organizations and groups like the work that is being done by Charlene and Whitney, that it's so crucial for them to have access to these records. And hearing Whitney talk about getting the plans after the fact and having to work backwards, I think that's something that archivists and archival professionals really need to think about. And speaking at a historical federation, historians as well, who may be aware of some of the information, working proactively together to help share the information is really important. And also, I think it's so important to recognize that memory is something that changes over time. The way we talk about what we remember and what happened in the past, we're witnessing right now memory being formed and changed and solidified in a way by our society, something that people had thought that they understood based on what they knew in the past, which other people knew differently. But that's really changing the way we see it, pulling these records together, and this work that Charlene and Whitney and others are doing, and seeing what the outcome is a really critical moment in our history to see how we're changing the way we think about these places, these institutions, and what happened at them. I think I'll leave it at that, because we've touched on a lot of the other things that I had noted down already. So I'm going to pass it back to Charlene now, with, I think it's three more slides relating to advocacy work that she's done in the past. So Charlene.
Good, thank you. This next slide just gives you an overview of the Indian residential schools in the province. There are 18 throughout the province, and also 3 Indian hospitals. So these residential schools were run by different church denominations, United, Anglican, and Catholic churches. The significance of the Indian hospitals in my view and my work is that even if our students attended St. Joseph's Mission Residential School, they were sent to places like Kokalitsa Indian Hospital because of TB and other health problems. So even if we have children that disappeared and did not return from St. Joseph's, we also sent children to Kokalitsa Indian Hospital, where they never returned from there either. So the coordination and collaboration between all of these schools within the province and the Indian hospitals is really critical for us at this time. Williams Lake First Nation, for sure, is one of the lead communities where I reflect back, Whitney, on yes to Kamloops. It's been 1 year since the announcement of the 215. And for us, we're probably talking with the delegates in this gathering about 10 months and relating about 10 months of work, which is extensive when I think of what we've been able to achieve to date to even get to the bottom of what happened to the children. that disappeared and are missing from St. Joseph's Mission and the work that we have to do. So this gives an overview throughout the province of where the residential schools were and where they were situated and the towns they were close by. Again, I think it's just important to know that even if we have residential schools in BC, in the north, some of the students were sent over to Alberta as well into those schools. So there's going to be a need for us to coordinate efforts with Alberta as well. And our databases are going to need to connect at some point. So this is just an overview. Again, I know that you'll be getting a copy of this PowerPoint, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I'm aware of the time frame that we have for the presentation. At the same time, again, we're recapping for you what's taken us 10 months to pull together. Good, thank you. Next. Good. I mentioned that children attended more than one institution. So even if they may have been here at St. Joseph's, they also attended the Kamloops Indian Residential School, or they may have been sent to Lejac or again, Sardis or Kokalitsa Indian Hospital. Again, I mentioned there were some that were sent into Alberta as well and never came home. So all of our students will be all over, the country, whether it's in the United States or other parts of the world. They've just moved. So our outreach includes not only our local area, but thinking about the rest of the country and where are these families from that lost loved ones and how do we work with them. This picture is just a picture of our children at a skit being loaded into a cattle truck to attend residential school. And, through my 30 years of advocacy, these are the kind of stories that I've had to listen to, where children just felt like pigs or they felt like cows being herded into a cattle truck. And you listen to these adult women now that were little girls at that point, where it was cold, it was freezing, and there's no place to go to the washrooms. So they would shield each other and help each other go to the washroom while this truck was going down the road to the residential school. Very dehumanizing, very degrading. And that's what our people are living with today. So when you see people on the streets and suffering with great trauma, the alcoholism, the addictions, a lot of that comes from this institution. We're going to address that eventually, but it's going to take time. So thank you. This is one picture. Next. In terms of where do we find hope in such what could be seen as a very dark time in our history. Our language, our culture and traditions that were outlawed and denied is today our greatest strength. So earlier, when you saw what I stated to the province and to Doug Todd, is that we didn't lose our language, we didn't lose our cultures, and really we're stronger for this because we're now relearning and stronger through ceremony. Whitney mentioned where our technical team goes through ceremony to even have started the work that they did, fully understand what residential schools were, and be able to, on a regular basis, make sure that they have ceremony so that they, to ensure their health and well-being as they search for the children, because they may have a GPR machine going up and down the cleared areas that Whitney mentioned, but it's very hard on them. And when they have to do their documentation and identify the reflections, it's their work, and it's all of us coming together. So we're really strong in ceremony, and we really make sure that we take care of our team in a very healthy way, and I'm really proud of that. The statement on the right side, I want to say it as brief as I understand and know this vision. So when I say that, how are we going to survive 150 years of colonization and institutionalization with such rampant abuse, neglect, violence, call it what you want? How do we survive that? One of our elders went to the mountain in fasting ceremonies years ago. And when he was in the mountain, he had this vision. So he had this vision of a Sikane stick and a Sikane dance. And he said that the elders told him that our ancestors predicted our future with the Kelmu, which means white people, any people. Our ancestors sang and prayed on the mountain for challenges that our people would face and dance to ceremony to cope with our loss in residential schools, foster homes, jails, colonization, 60s scoop, that we were going to go through a deep, dark period of our time on this earth. And we have, and we still are. But our resiliency is strengthened through our Sikane dance. And for us to be able to have this dance with the Sikane stick so that we can make sure we move forward with our children and that our grandchildren can stand with the rest of the world, that we're not going to remain victims of government, churches, or anyone, that we're going to be stronger for everything that we've been through. So that Sikane dance and grand entry is done at the beginning of a lot of our gatherings. And it's a ceremony for our children to grow up to be loving, forgiving people. And for us to make sure that as adults and as myself as a grandma for two little ones, that our grandchildren reach their potential, that they stand with the rest of the world, that they know they're just as good as anybody else. That's a big commitment that we have to make sure that our children don't ever go through what we've gone through. Again, the Sikane song and dance, again, is just for, if we can understand that our ancestors saw this deep, dark period of our time, but gave us songs and ceremonies and dances to be able to listen, learn, process, heal, and still be together as four races of the world, red, yellow, black, and white. We're very fortunate that elders had these visions, and we're now living out those visions. Today at Alkali, we enjoy 40 years of sobriety. We're relearning, our languages and cultures. So I can't say enough, about what work has been done to date and where we've come and where we need to go. But in closing, if this is my last slide, where you ask the question, like, what would the research do for you? How would it help you? To me, it would help to just be able to bring closure for myself. If I was to come back to my grandfather, for example, we still cannot find his death certificate. Like, for the life of me, it has to be somewhere. We've worked with the BC Archives branch. We've looked various places, but my grandpa, along with Duncan Sticks, there's two children that we can't even find death records for. So it would help for me we know he went there. We know he committed suicide. We know he died. We also know that the coroner service couldn't find a way to even care and have an inquest as to how our children died, but finding those records and seeing information in black and white would just really help me to know and understand that and have that closure. But again, I guess in my closing comments, just for yourselves as archivists or researchers or whatever way that you are, for whatever reason that you're on this call, I encourage you to share what you know or search for what you might want to be involved in, anything to be helpful to us, because it is very challenging, where I have heard our leaders and our survivors say, why is this all on us now? Our children went there, the government sent us there, the nuns and the priests did this. Now we're the ones left to try and figure it all out. And it shouldn't be that way. Somehow we should be able to stand with one another, to be able to get share our truth, and for you to be able to help us find the documents that we need so that we can have that closure. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I think the next slide is back to Whitney for a few slides.
Thanks, Genevieve. Yeah, and so when we talk about the legacy of this project and moving forward and the importance of making these records actually accessible to community, one thing that we will eventually be doing is starting a database for the St. Joseph's Mission. And it will most likely also have a very public facing aspect to it as well. So it may become more of a like a virtual museum, for lack of a better term to describe it, with a restricted portion where we do have archival information, but also a public education piece where it's forward facing and people can, you know, come to that site and be able to learn the history of the St. Joseph's Mission. So this is again a slide of a photograph that we do have of students at the institution, and one that came to us from NCTR. So next slide. And this is just about the actual creation of the database. So we'll be inputting, you know, thousands of documents that we have, enrollment records, photographs, baptismal, census, interment, and other records that we've come across. And again, you know, just to reference, like, we literally have archives coming in from all over the place. It seems like I'll come into my office on a daily basis and there'll be a new photograph or a new something, or someone, you know, had something in their closet and brought it out. So this is sort of collating all of that material and making it accessible even to us. Like, it is fantastic to have the information, but there is a lot of information, and sifting through it and prioritizing what's important in the moment has become sort of a triage process. At this point, we have a posting out for a full-time research position with the nation in order to do some of this archiving, in order to do some of the actual, you know, legwork of just even properly naming things and putting them into the right folder. Because, like, we definitely need that capacity as well too. So that's a hint, nudge. There is a posting out there. If you know anybody who's interested in that position, please do let them know and have them apply. Next slide. So this is a response objectives update. So as I did mention, we're currently in phase 2 of geophysical works, including an assessment of an area known to have contained burial locations. So that location came to us through the RBCM, through that Father Thomas memoirs and other information that we had previously, all coming together and matching up. The archival research is ongoing. I think we've kind of thoroughly discussed that, but it will be ongoing. These are one of these processes that will just be ongoing until the project is basically over. Engaging with the federal government, provincial government, BC Coroner's Office, and other entities, and community level engagement. So in terms of engaging different communities with respect to their missing and deceased loved ones, actually engaging on the front of potential excavation and exhumation. So survivor interviews. This is one thing that I wanted to talk on, just in terms of different types of archival information. So we are also creating archival information as we go. We've created like a one-stop email where people can email in and say, you know, I have information about the residential school, or I attended and I'd like to do a survivor interview. So we have done about 22 survivor interviews to date. And so again, you know, this is a collection of audio, it's a collection of video, it's a collection of archival, in that we create a transcript. And so we're actively involved in making archival records as well through this process. And so it just is another kind of a highlight of, you know, how complex this undertaking really is. This is a survivor interview photograph. We do take a photograph at the end of the interview if folks are willing, and we share them out in our weekly brief. So we have a weekly brief that goes out in terms of the investigation progress. This is Teresa Holt and her daughter, Chief Linda Price. So some of you may know Corey Price. This is Corey Price's mom and grandmother, and they came in to do a survivor interview. Teresa actually attended during the industrial school phase, and so she is one of the only surviving elders who attended like that early on in the school. So again, just the insight of her memories of that time and what the operations of the school actually were like are just invaluable, just completely priceless, because there is no other explanation of that time from survivors' perspective. So cultural health and wellness, and Charlene did talk a little bit about this, but this is a key priority for us. We were fortunate to have a large gathering during the first day of Truth and Reconciliation Day in September of last year. And one of the things that really drives home the importance of the cultural health and wellness is we actually did lose a community member to suicide on that day. And so it just is really important to note that while yes, the archives and the photographs and everything are very important, and it does help drive the investigation, but there are living people who are experiencing real visceral trauma and who are actively being re-traumatized by these processes. So we have to take a role in making sure that we provide those supports and health and wellness. So a huge part of what we do is making sure that these things are happening in community. And this is that September 30th Orange Shirt Day ceremony at WLFN Powwow Arbor. Just a fantastic day, so powerful. So much drumming and singing and people from just all around gathering. There was a procession leading from the mission over to the Powwow Arbor that was, kilometers long. There were so many cars. It was absolutely overwhelming response. So lots of community support for what we're doing. Challenges. Okay, well, this is where the rubber really hits the road. There definitely is a lot of challenges, throughout this whole process. One of them is, of course, that if we were going to undertake this investigation on such a scale, if you had to ask me, I would have said we need several years to plan, and we didn't have that lead time. So one of the key challenges is timing. But specifically related to archival, we need for archival documents to be released to caretaker communities in unredacted format. So even things that we are getting from Library and Archives Canada, things that we're getting from NCTR are coming to us in redacted format. And that's not really conducive to actively looking for, deceased children, because often there's just a notation in the margin or on an annual report or something about a child being deceased. And so redacting any amount of information really does hamper us in that piece of the investigation. There are several sets of records on which Privacy Act reviews have not been completed. And so just understanding how, we're going to be able to deal with that. Again, while we're midstream, we do need the documents, and of course we want to be able to access them, but we know that there's these other critical reviews that institutions like RBCM have to go through in order to get that access. And the requirement of multiple MOUs with different organizations to receive materials. This to me, again, it's part of that institutionalization of archives. It's important. It's important for us to be able to facilitate access to the records. But WLFN is in a position where we have a lot of internal capacity. We have a very strong team. And I have concerns for, other smaller nations where there isn't as much capacity, how they're going to be able to deal with, executing these MOUs and traveling to be able to access archives and all these things. So that's a key thing as well. And so this slide is our WLFN response requirements from the federal government of Canada. And so this is a slide that actually comes directly out of my presentation to the Prime Minister that I made to him a couple of months ago when he was in Williams Lake. And so basically are saying, we need to be able to gather this information from all of the institutions that have it. And we need a commitment to an independent legal review, because what's lurking in these documents is more sinister than just, the death and disappearance of children. There is documents that indicate the culpability of Canada, province of BC, the Oblates, Catholic Church, and amongst others, and individuals as well too. So we are in possession of thousands of documents that need that legal review. And those processes are not funded at the moment through either the federal or provincial government. So we need to be able to report on the contents and implications of those documents without being restricted by government involvement. So that's key for us at this point. That's where we are at a crossroads with archival material right now.
I think this is my slide, and
Okay.
thank you very much. In
Yep.
the interest of time, though, I actually don't think I'm going to spend much time on this because, Whitney, thank you. You covered off everything really succinctly in your discussion around capacity, and all I was going to do was basically reiterate what you said in terms of privacy reviews. I guess the only thing I would add to it is the intensive labor involved in processing, arranging, and describing records in order to make them accessible to the public is huge. And then adding digitization on top of that, but making sure that digitization doesn't lose the really crucial contextual information and metadata that is needed to actually make it useful. So all of that, and I won't get into the everything else that is going on with the museum and archives, that adds a lot of time pressure and resource pressure on the end of the archives, and that's, as far as I understand, the same across the profession and the industry. So yeah, thank you. I think you covered it all well, but I can answer detailed questions about that if people want to get into it more.
I think really just hammering home the issue of capacity. It does take a lot of time and energy to do these things, and I know I'm in a room full of people who appreciate like just the sheer volume and intensive time and labor it takes to do these archival things. So I'm appreciative of the audience, and thank you for listening to what we had to say today. There are some comments in the chat box, so we can maybe go there afterwards, but yeah, thanks very much for everyone's time.
Good, thank you, Whitney. The only thing that I want to maybe close in is it's been a really interesting process being involved in the day in, day out work that we've reported on today, and working closely with Whitney and the rest of our team. It's really, really helpful for me to be able to say that we knew that our children disappeared and never came home. It's been good to be involved in the criminal aspects of what's happened with some of our children, but also be able to do some of the research about what the residential school was. And now at what I consider, would hopefully be a final stage of residential school work, where we knew the children were missing. We are hearing their stories. And when we have gone to the RBCM or gotten other records from NCTR, and their stories are corroborated and confirmed in black and white, that helps me. And I know what we know what our truth is, but it's coming together through our truth telling combined with the research that we've had to do. So it's really helpful, and but it's also time consuming. So with Whitney, I agree where, if there's one of you out there that would like the challenge of doing this kind of work with us, we're looking for somebody to work with us. And I'll leave that. Thank you.